A rude neighbor kept blocking his parking space, so he got the perfect revenge. Have you ever had to deal with obnoxious neighbors? You know the kind. The ones that keep you up all night with their stomping feet. The ones that you just can't bring yourself to like, no matter how much you try. Well, if you have experience with a horrible neighbor, then you'll definitely be able to relate to the guy in our story. He couldn't believe what he was seeing as he walked into the parking lot. Despite his warnings, the car was there once again. The man felt something snap, and ideas began to swirl around his brain. As his mouth finally relaxed, a wide grin appeared on his face. He had the perfect plan that would make this man regret parking in his spot. Reddit user AngryAussieGam3R was done. He had left more than one warning on this vehicle, asking the owner not to block him in, but the owner refused to listen. Luckily, this Redditor was a resourceful kind of guy, and he had the perfect secret weapon to pull off the stunt of a lifetime. And he knew exactly what he needed to do to get his revenge. This particular Redditor just so happened to be a skilled mechanic. His love for cars started when he was a teenager, but now, there was nothing in life that he loved more than to lift up the hood of a car to find out how they work. The bolts and nuts were beautiful to him, and he only needed the smallest of excuses to get his tools out. As this Redditor became an adult, he received his vehicle maintenance certification. He did an extremely good job during his apprenticeship, as well. He was soon an expert when it came to his trade, and over time he learned the necessary skills that would later allow him to pull off the biggest prank of his life. Obviously, the inconsiderate car owner had no idea what he was getting into. There were assigned parking areas in the apartment block that AngryAussieGam3R lived in. The concept was quite simple. Each apartment had 2 parking spots that were lined in 2 rows, facing one another. But this meant that everyone would have to carefully coordinate their vehicles so no one was ever parked against the barrier. This Redditor had come up with an easy solution to make sure that no one was ever blocked in. He would leave the furthest spot open for visitors, and when they told him that they would be arriving, he would park his car in the spot against the wall. Unfortunately, there was a tenant who didn't care about making the Redditor's life more difficult. For some reason, the inconsiderate tenant would park in the space that the Reddit user left open for his guests, blocking him against the wall in the process. This had happened to AngryAussieGam3R on several occasions. Because of how big the apartment building was, AngryAussieGam3R had no clue who was doing it. He immediately turned to peace for getting this person to stop, but things got out of control. We've all been in the position where we've wanted to leave a nasty note to someone who was parked like a jerk. Or maybe your neighbor has been stealing your newspaper and you don't want a confrontation. Either way, it's pretty common for people to leave notes when they're not happy with their neighbor's behavior. One Saturday afternoon, AngryAussieGam3R was getting ready to go away for the weekend with friends, but as soon he walked out to his car he noticed that the rude tenant had struck again. The week before, AngryAussieGam3R had left a polite note on the car's windshield, asking the owner if he wouldn't block his car in on Fridays, but whatever the reason, the rude tenant refused to cooperate. AngryAussieGam3R needed a new plan. In hopes of getting help, the Reddit user called the building manager. As patiently as he could, he explained what was happening. As it turns out, the rude tenant got too drunk the night before and didn't move his car as he should have Saturday morning. He clearly didn't care if his actions affected other people. The Reddit user was becoming angrier by the second, but the building manager still didn't want to do anything to help the situation. The Reddit user then decided to call a tow company, but there was nothing they could do. The parking lot was 3 stories up, and because of the height restriction, the tow truck couldn't get their truck up there. After a lot of consideration, the Redditor realized that he would have to take care of the situation by himself. He obviously had to take the situation into his own hands. If the manager wasn't going to help him, and the tow truck couldn't help him, then he had no other options. Luckily, he was a creative fella. As he giggled with glee, AngryAussieGam3R was coming up with a brand new plan. His revenge was going to be epic and the rude tenant was going to regret ever blocking him in. The man called his friends, and together they drove to the man's garage. It was time to pull out his most prized possession. The mechanic grabbed his vehicle positioning jacks and brought along 6 friends for the ride. He attached a jack to each of the wheels, and then they all began to push. He could feel how easily the hydraulics were lifting the vehicle. The jacks made the process of lifting and turning the car around much easier than it should have been. But the Reddit mechanic wasn't done with the rude tenant just yet. Gathering all of their strength, the mechanic and his friends wheeled the vehicle to the other side of the parking garage. There were no parking spots on this side, so it was perfect. A load-supporting beam was there, with a tiny space behind it. With the car's nose facing the wall, the men put the car into the tiny space. Excited about his work, the angry Osigam 3R exclaimed, "Good luck finding your car," as he stood by admiring the prank. Now that he could get his car out, the mechanic left with his friends for their weekend trip. But the whole time he was away, he was bursting with excitement. Would the rude tenant find his car, and what would he do once he did? He was looking forward to finding out. When the mechanic returned home from his trip, he noticed that the tenant's car was still where he had moved it. But the car's front wheels had been turned. Angry Osigam 3R and his group of friends couldn't help but laugh when they thought about the man's face when he discovered that his car was missing, and even more so when he found out where it was. How would you feel if you were in this situation? The tenant was definitely going to be really angry, but he kind of deserved it. Hopefully, the mechanic would be able to watch all of it happen from a few aisles down. Considering that the car was a foot away from the car and a foot away from a pillar, it really wasn't surprising that the tenant wasn't able to move his vehicle. The following day, though, the mechanic looked for the car again, but it was gone. And oddly enough, he never saw it again. Nobody knows how the owner of the car was able to get the car out of the tight space, but our mechanic is definitely sure of this. The rude tenant will think again before he decides to park in someone else's spot. And of all of the people that he could have done this to, the tenant chose to pick a fight with a talented mechanic with the right equipment for the job. Angry Osigam 3R posted his prank on the pages of Reddit and people couldn't believe what he had done, but they loved it. Every single person has thought about serving karma to inconsiderate and rude drivers, which made people love this story even more. His thread, which was called Pro Revenge, went viral and people from all of the world were chuckling right along with the mechanic. People loved that the mechanic was so creative. And they were impressed by his ingenious plan to get revenge. But what mattered more to the people was that he got his point across without having to get violent. But there were also a lot of people who were asking about whether or not Angry Osigam 3R had the right to move the car, and they explained that he could be charged with a crime. Angry Osigam 3R responded, "My research shows that the only way I could be charged is if I had illegally gained access inside the vehicle, or moved it with the intention of selling, lending, or gifting the vehicle to someone else. The issue gets more murky if I had moved it off the property, but as it is I simply gained access to my vehicle." But did the driver actually learn his lesson? The moral of this story is simple: be a considerate person. Don't intentionally make someone's life any harder than it needs to be. Be a good neighbor and park your car in your own spot, and these things won't happen.